Failure to observe these guidelines may result in the termination of your connection to the conference. If you have any connectivity issues, please send a chat to one of the individuals on this video with the name Tech Support. For those connecting using phone only, please email aafortwayne@gmail.com with your name and phone number so that our tech support person can help. And the Unconventional Convention is free to all participants. However, donations are welcome. Please go to our Fort Wayne Area Intergroup website at aafortwayne.org/donate. The link is also posted in our chat. And I have one last joke for you guys. I think the Al-Anons would really like this. So what's the difference between a large pizza and a drunk? The large pizza can feed a family of 4. That's one of my favorites. Okay. If there is a newcomer that wishes to talk to someone in AA or Al-Anon, please send your number to the newcomer greeter host in the chat and they will contact you. Please also see aafortwayne.org/new to AA for more information. For everyone that is comfortable, could we all please leave our video on so the speakers can see all your beautiful faces? If anyone has questions for the speakers, please put them in the chat. If we have enough time after they are done sharing, they will be more than happy to answer some questions. Okay, now I am going to read out of the big book from page 11 and Bill's story requested by our last speaker today. Okay, and it is, but my friend sat before me and he made the point blank declaration that God had done for him what he could not have done for himself. His human will had failed. Doctors had pronounced him incurable. Society was about to lock him up. Like myself, he admitted complete defeat. Then he had, in effect, been raised from the dead, suddenly taken from the scrape heap to a level of life better than the best he had ever known. And with that, I would have the pleasure and honor to introduce you to David D.
Thanks, Courtney. My name's Dave D. I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Dave.
Thank you all. I want to thank the committee for asking me to be here with you today at your Unconventional Convention. I want to thank Bill and Joan. Boy, what a week you have had, and what a reminder of the power of Alcoholics Anonymous to help us not only through the mountaintop times of our life, but that to help us through, as the big book says, those certain trials and low spots. And I love that when we go through those, we don't have to do it alone. And so you guys will both be in my prayers and thoughts over the coming weeks, and until we find out sort of the prognosis and in the way ahead, right? One of the things that I always like to do when I kind of start off is a little prayer, and if you guys don't mind, I like to set aside prayer. It's kind of one of my favorites, and I'm not sure how big it is in Indiana, but if you wouldn't mind bearing with me, maybe we can open with that. It kind of goes like this for those who don't know. God, please help us set aside everything we think we know about you, about ourselves, about our disease, and the 12 steps, so that we may have an open mind and a new experience of all these things. Please help us see the truth. Amen. Amen. So Courtney read what to me is sort of the summary of my story in one paragraph or maybe even one sentence. And so I'll start there. On page 11, we find Bill having a conversation about somebody, and it turns out it's this guy, Ebby Thatcher. And when I was brand new to AA, I was a little confused by this guy who shows up and seems like he's 12-stepping Bill, because I thought like Bill and Bob started this thing. Who's this dude who's like Bill's talking about on page 11? And it turns out that it's one of his childhood friends who had actually found sobriety in something called the Oxford Group, the predecessor to AA. There's a whole amazingly cool kind of AA history story that starts with Carl Jung and a guy named Roland Hazard, and kind of ties all the way through to this conversation. But in short, this childhood friend of Bill, who was a real drunk like Bill was, had a spiritual experience and had come to try to pass on this idea that maybe God, if you let God into your life, that maybe he can take away the problem of alcoholism and give you a whole new life. And so Bill, Bill's drinking his gin, listening to his buddy Ebby, and kind of reflects, this line in 11 is kind of after that, as Bill's kind of reflected on what Ebby had to say. And I love in here that he says, doctors have pronounced him incurable. And so this kind of echoes my story. Society was about to lock him up. Like myself, he had admitted complete defeat. Then he had, in effect, been raised from the dead, suddenly taken from the scrap heap of humanity to a level of life better than the best have ever known. And so if I had to tell my story in one line, just like Bill did when he opened up, AA works. If I had to tell my story in one sentence, it would say, I can tell you without a doubt that I've been taken from the scrap heap of humanity, and I've been given over the last 30 years a level of life better than the best have ever known. I do have a home group. It's the Bowie Friday Night Speakers Group in Bowie, Maryland. I'm coming to you from Annapolis, Maryland. And I have a sobriety date. It's June 23rd, 1990. So I haven't been sober in Al-Anon as long as Bill and Joan, but I've been here long enough to be absolutely sure that what Bill said is true, is that AA absolutely works. It works like clockwork. It works day in, it works day out. It works in the darkest times. It works in the brightest lights and the brightest spots in our lives, right? It's a constant that has been in my life for 30 years. And of all the things that have happened to me, great and small in my life, the thing that stands out is the most consistent, the constant, the bedrock of everything that I have and am and try to be today, is all comes directly out of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. So it's always a privilege and an honor to get a chance to share that passion with you, because I am passionate about AA, and I hope that comes across. And I hope if you're new in this meeting, here, and as I'm telling my story, whether or not you believe this for yourself, because when I was brand new and I heard folks like me talk, I wasn't sure it would work for me, but I hope you believe that I believe. I hope you believe that I believe. And so my journey begins on June 22nd, 1990. It's really not where my journey begins with AA. I've been in and out of AA for 3 years at that point. I'm 22 years old. I come to AA for the first time when I was 19. I'll tell you the kind of alcoholic I am. And the irony of it is that, this is the uncommon convention, but I'm a common drunk. Matter of fact, I'm so common that 33 years before, or actually, I guess, really, let's see, let me do the math right, because it's actually 39. 29 years before I was born, there's a perfect description on page 21 in the big book of the kind of drunk I am. So I'm going to read that, because I don't want to spend too much of the hour talking about the kind of alcoholic I am. I want to spend, a lot of time talking about the last 30 years in AA and the power and the transformation that's happened because I showed up and became willing to follow some directions of a sponsor, and have been with you ever since. But on page 21, it describes me very well. It says, but what about the real alcoholic? He may start off as a moderate drinker. He may or may not become a continuous hard drinker, but at some stage of his drinking career, he begins to lose all control of his liquor consumption once he starts to drink. Here's a fellow who's been puzzling you, especially in his lack of control. Notice how they keep using this term, lack of control. He does absurd, incredibly tragic things while drinking. He's a real Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He is seldom mildly intoxicated. He is more or less insanely drunk. His disposition while drinking resembles his normal nature, but little. He may be one of the finest fellows in the world, yet let him drink for a day and he frequently becomes disgustingly and even dangerously antisocial. He has a positive genius for getting drunk at exactly the wrong moments, particularly when some important decision must be made or an engagement kept. That's me. That is me. The only thing that's probably a little different about me than that description is I didn't kind of have this gradual transition into alcoholism. It seemed like alcohol did the magic for me, right from the beginning. My first sponsor, Tom F., who's no longer with us in body, but will always be with me and many of those he touched in spirit. He said, Dave, I wasn't a problem drinker. I was an answer drinker, And what he meant by that is that alcohol, his problem was sobriety. His problem was living life, a normal, everyday, middle of the road kind of life. And that sounded absolutely painful and depressing to him but alcohol seemed to make that all okay, seemed to transform that boring, dull life into something amazing. And that's what it did for me at 13 years old. You know, blackout drinker right from the beginning. And over a period of time, you know, basically, you know, alcohol went from being fun, you know, to fun with problems, to problems and a little fun. In the end, it almost cost me my life. And I'll talk a little bit about that now. So June 22nd, 1990, at this point, I've been in and out of AA for 3.5 years. I pretty much destroyed everything that's decent and worthwhile in my life. I was blessed to have a bunch of people in my life who tried to teach me well. I was raised by a single mom. My dad got killed in Vietnam, so I didn't have the ideal upbringing, but I can look back now and see how I had grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins, all who tried to surround me, and tried to fill the hole left by my father's loss. You know, I had, you know, I was a pretty smart kid. I had a lot going for me as a decent athlete. I mean, there were a lot of things that I had before alcoholism really caught up with me. I had a bright future. I had a lot of potential, the teachers would say, right? Which I seem to often, you know, it was often that I failed to live up to it or work up to it, but I had a lot apparently. And I had burned all that away. You know, by the time, you know, I kind of got to you in the early hours of the morning of June 23rd, 1990, you know, the people that loved me had that wrecked look in their eyes, you know, and there wasn't a lot of them who were left that were close to me. You know, our big book talks about we're a tornado roaring our way through the lives of others. And most people had sense to get free of the tornado, but there were some who stayed right in the middle of it. And those who did wound up, you know, they wound up with that wrecked look, that the tears in their eyes and the pain that I could see on their faces. And I had been in and out of AA for 3 years at that point. And if there's a hell to be had on earth, and many of you know because you've been there, or you're the family member in Al-Anon who had lived through that hell of a drunk getting sober, you know, getting a day, a week, a month or 2 or 6, and then drinking again, building those hopes up and then tearing it out again, right? Tearing your heart out again, right? And that's what I did to the people that loved me. That's what I did to my mom's one of us. She had done a geographic cure a few years before I got sober. And thank God she's sober a year longer than me. And I hope it always stays that way. But I had lived with my grandparents through the worst of my drinking, my mom's parents, and I had destroyed their lives. You know, I had destroyed their lives. They loved me like a son, and I had literally destroyed their lives. And so the last little bit of a joy that I brought to them was on the morning of June 22nd, 1990, my grandfather picked me up out of jail. No big deal. It was a drunken assault and battery. Those are the kind of things I'd done. In the last 2 weeks, I'd wrecked a car, another car. There were many cars that had been wrecked. I had the girlfriend that I was dating at the time who looked at me with those eyes and the tears running down her cheek. And she put her finger in her chest and she said, "I wish I never would have met you. You'll never change." And I knew she was right. See, I had given up blaming other people and circumstances by this point. I knew the problem was me. And I really hated who I'd become, but I was powerless. I was so powerless that I just couldn't not drink. You know, I drank on antabuse twice. You know, I had these crazy thoughts like I'm not an alcoholic in Mexico. I mean, and these things are things that I did physically sober, right? I mean, you know, I'm a real alcoholic, you know. And there's all other kind of crazy stuff that went along with that, all kinds of other things I did and people I hurt and you know, and things that you know, I'm not sure in some ways that I can ever make right. But I'm really grateful that AA and the God that I have is a God of grace, right? That you know, that if there is some kind of justice, that perhaps that will happen for me one day. But I certainly have been a real recipient of grace and mercy in Alcoholics Anonymous over the last 30 years. And so, you know, and so this is who I brought on June 22nd, 1990. I couldn't wait for my grandfather to kind of, you know, he picked me up from jail. I couldn't wait to get away from him because the voices are in my head, and the only thing that I've got, you know, at this point in my life to be able to cope with these kind of things is drinking. And so I got away from him and started drinking somewhere around noon. And by that night, me and some friends of mine had closed down the bar and leaving the bar. And I was a violent, you know, bright lights, nightclub, fast car, crazy kind of drunk. My nickname was Crazy Dave. It wasn't Gangster Dave or Tough Guy Dave or Badass Dave. It was Crazy Dave. And I lived up to that name. And so leaving the bar, you know, one of the guys that was with us wanted to sit in the front seat, and I didn't know this guy, Gene. He was a friend of my my buddy's brother, like he was just kind of tagging along with us. I'm like, who the hell are you, Gene? Get in the back seat, right? And Gene thought he was important, so he sat in the front seat. And it was my buddy Mike's car, and so I told Gene, you don't get out of that front seat, I'm going to punch you. It was a summer day, the window was down, and Gene didn't know me really well. I might be crazy, Dave, but I'm also a man of my word. And if I say I'm going to hit you, if you don't do something, you don't do it, I'm going to hit you. And I hit Gene about 3 times, really hard, really fast. And my buddy Mike freaks out. He's like, oh, crazy Dave, man, this is what I would do. We'd be having a good time. It'd be a great night. We were singing at this piano bar, right? A cheerleader that I had my eye on in high school was like interested in me, which was really good because the girlfriend that I was with was about burned out. So I needed a new one. And it was a great night, right? Other than getting locked up in the morning and, all the usual junk. But as nights go, it's a good night until Dave freaking snaps. And there he is punching Gene, poor Gene, just sitting in the front seat of the car, getting hit in the face. And Mike comes running around. And I don't know about you, but every now and again, I have those moments where I realize I've overreacted. And Mike's kind of freaking out. I like Mike. Mike's a really good friend. And I'm like, damn, sorry, Gene. Gene wasn't hearing sorry. And Gene wasn't a little guy. So when Gene came out of the car, we were on the second story of a parking garage in Baltimore, Maryland. We've been up at nightclubs that night, and a little section called the Brokerage, and it sits right in downtown Baltimore. And this parking garage, we were on the second floor, and parking garages, when you're against the wall, right, the outside wall, they tend to have like a concrete wall that goes up to about your shoulder, so the cars can't drive off and fall down, right? And then there's an open spot. It's like a window to the next floor. Well, when Gene tackled me, and I don't think Gene meant to do this, I went out the window. And I fell 20 feet and landed on the sidewalk of Lombard Street on my head. And all I remember about that situation was when I let Gene out of the car and feeling my feet come off the ground and going, that was a bad move on my part. I know better than that. And then the next thing I know, the rest of that night is being awake, moments or minutes and out for hours. And the bottom line was it cracked my skull from one side to the other. Blood started pouring out of my ears, and thank God, thank God Mike was a good enough friend to not just leave me there and drive away, but they got me in the car and they drove me to a hospital. And by the time they got me to the hospital, I'd almost bled to death. By the time my grandparents got there, about an hour after this happened, half of my body had become paralyzed. And what they had told my grandfather, that the doctors had told my grandfather, that I would die that night or that I would be brain dead. It's what I brought to you the early hours of the morning of June 23rd, 1990. And one of the first scenes that happened in that hospital as I came to, and my grandfather's holding my hand. And my grandfather's one of these World War II greatest generation type guys, guy that doesn't cry, his word is his bond. He's, an amazing reputation. He's a blue collar worker, worked hard his whole life. But man, in that neighborhood that I grew up in, their last name was Johnson. That name meant something. And the fact that I was Walter Johnson's grandson meant something until I destroyed the reputation, until people would say, isn't it a shame that Walter and Shirley, have a grandson like David? Isn't that a shame? Right? That's the legacy that they'll leave behind one day. And here I am dying on a hospital bed. And my grandfather looks at me, and my grandfather he was in World War II and in Atlantic and the Pacific campaigns. He was there for 5 years. He went in at 17, didn't come out till he was 22, and it was over. He was a paramedic and a fireman for 30 years after that. And he told me later, he said, I've seen a lot of men and women in your condition, Dave. I never saw one of them live. And as I come to in my hand, I feel my hand in his, and I can feel the life drifting away from me. One of my favorite spiritual writers, a guy named Thomas Merton, a Catholic monk, talks about a near-death experience in his teenage years before he became a monk, before he had a religious transformation, when he had really squandered the life that God had given him. And he describes it this way, which is much more poetic, and even no words really do what I experienced that night justice. Merton says this: there's no need to look when death is in the room. You can feel it in the chill, in the marrow of your bones. There's a coldness and a darkness and a terror that I experienced as I held my grandfather's hand and I looked into his eye, knowing that I'm going to die. And it's not death itself, I don't think. It was knowing that God had given me a great gift, that he had given me the gift of life. And I felt like, not all of us feel this way, but I felt like from the time that I was a child, like there was some special purpose, that I felt a connection. I felt a connection really young, you know. And through my drinking, I had pushed that away. It wasn't that I never stopped believing. It's just I thought that I was too bad for God. And in that moment, it all came crashing down, that this is not the life I was supposed to live. This is not the death I'm supposed to die. And yet here I am, and it's over. And my grandfather said a look of terror came across my face, and I asked him if I was going to die, and his hand began to shake in mine, and a tear ran down his cheek, and I knew the answer. And he said, just as my eyes rolled back in my head, I looked up at the ceiling, and I said, God, please help me. Forward prayer. Prayer of dying men and women all around this world. God, please help me. And the short answer is he did. Yeah. Now, he didn't light up the room. I didn't get the Bill Wilson God in my room, Peppermint Patty mountaintop experience. Nope, didn't get that one. My eyes shut and I passed out for another 2 hours. And the next time I came to, I heard a prayer being said over me. And it turns out the prayer was being said by my grandmother's pastor. See, my grandmother was a woman of faith and action. You know, she believed faith without works is dead. And she was a member of a church. And when her grandson's laying there dying in the hospital bed, she says a prayer on top of my head. And then she picks up the phone and she starts calling people. And this ain't like cell phone days, right? This is 1990, right? This is like phone ringing, you know, getting her prayer group out of their bed, 3 a.m. She's calling her prayer warriors, right? And in the early days of my recovery, I thought my prayer mattered, that four-word prayer. And I'm not saying it didn't, but I tell you what, I imagine today, you know, my grandmother on phone call after phone call after phone call after phone call, you know, and all these old women, I got a chance to meet them and thank them later. And they all looked a lot like my grandmother, you know, they're all 70 years old with gray hair. My grandmother's 5 foot tall and 5 foot around, but she's just full of spirit, man. That's what they look like on the outside. And I can just imagine, you know, these women getting up and taking that phone call. And if they can get up, if they can get on their knees, they're getting on their knees. But if they can't, they're saying a prayer in their bed and they're pulling open their Bibles and they're praying for Shirley's grandson. And I imagine in the spiritual world, what I like to think, the image that I have is me, you know, across the lines in the darkness and the blackness that is hell if there is one. As I can feel the terror. And these amazing prayer warriors, you know, looking like the special forces, man, come rolling in, man, shields and armor and big swords, man. And they're fighting back the darkness. And they're grabbing me and they're pulling me back 1 inch at a time. And as one gets tired, another one grabs me. And they pull me back, and then, you know, and then by 4 o'clock in the morning, her pastor shows up and he's praying over me and he's putting his hands on me and he's begging God to give me another chance. But he also knows that it's probably over because that's what the doctors say. And he's asking God, as I come to, I can hear his prayer, and his prayer is this: God, may you find forgiveness for David in the next life, for this one is over. It is over. And as my eyes come all the way open, I see that man walk out the door. And as he walks out the door, my eyes focus across the room. And there's my sponsor, Tom, my A sponsor. It's like 4 a.m. and there he is on the wall, just him and me. Am I imagining that? You know, what, you know, I'm baffled. Like, how did he get here? And it turns out that my grandmother didn't just call her pastor. It turns out that she didn't just call her prayer warriors. That my sponsor had done what it says in working with others in our big book, as we should do as members of AA. He found out who was closest to me, and he found out it was my grandmother. He found out and he believed that when everyone else gave up on me, that woman would be still standing. And so he made sure when he didn't hear from me, as we do, you know how we vanish. We're all in for a day, a week, a month or two, and then we just vanish. He reached out to my grandmother and he said, here's my number. The time may come when it seems like all is lost. The time may come when it seems like David is without hope. And if you call me, I'll come day or night. And so at some point, In the early hours of the morning of June 23rd, 1990, my grandmother picked up the phone and my sponsor, Tom, took the call. He got out of his bed with 9 years sober. He was about 60 years old at the time. And he took that call. And she said, I thought you'd want to know. David probably won't live through the night. And he said, I'll be right there. So he was there, right? 30 years later, man, it still tears me up because he was there. If he hadn't taken that call, would I be here? I don't know how long he stood there and waited for the time to come when everyone was out gone. It was just he and I. And God opened up that moment. When my eyes locked on him, it was just he and I in that room. And he walked over and he looked down at me with these eyes of just love and compassion and conviction. Again, words fail me here. And he reached down and he put his hand on my shoulder and he says, it never has to be this way again. And that was the early hours of the morning of June 23rd, 1990. And I have never had a day as dark or as hopeless since, because of what that man did for me, because of what AA did for me. And what you all do is you just don't show up once, right? You just don't show up once and, do a little 12-step call and put a hand on the shoulder, man. And, Tom told me later, he said, I looked down at you and my heart broke. He said, I was covered in my own vomit. By now it looked like I had a stroke. Half my body was paralyzed and blood was still coming out of my ears and they still weren't sure if I was going to live or die. He said, but I looked in your eyes and I saw a man, if there is a hell, stood in the middle of it. If there was a man who had lost his soul, it was you, and my heart broke for you. And I could feel that compassion. I could feel that love. But with it, there was this underpinning of some kind of conviction, some kind of power that I know today was the grace of God. And I really do believe in that tangible transmission, the power that we have to change lives. That we're not the power, but we're the conduit through which the power to transform lives, to raise people from the dead, to give them a life better than the best have ever known. We get to be the pipe through which that power flows. And that's what Tom was that night. And that's what I was the recipient of in that bed, even though I didn't really know it or appreciate it. And the next day he came back and he brought you. He brought reinforcements and you came back to that hospital day after day, week after week. And you spoon-fed me hope. You spoon-fed me hope. And the day that I got out of that hospital and I didn't die, but man, I was a mess. They call it traumatic brain injuries today is what they call them. And mine was bad. And the whole one side of my body was paralyzed and I would have seizures. And I couldn't really, I knew who I was, but it's like coming out of blackouts and I couldn't really read anymore. Man, I'd done a real number on myself. I was physically breathing. And when you all weren't there, the voices would come in and I'd look at the paralyzed face in the mirror and yeah, I was alive, but man, boy, I was wondering if it was a good thing or not. And then you all would come and you spoon feed me hope. And I think maybe, just maybe, regardless of what happens on the outside, maybe, just maybe, there might be something worth saving on the inside. And I got out of that hospital a few weeks later. And I'm not even home like an hour and the doorbell rings. And I'm scared to death because I'm paralyzed and they made a little like room for me on my grandparents' first floor. Like I'm, getting settled into my, my disabled room. And my grandmother comes in and said, there's some men here to see you from AA, Dave. And she helps me up because I can't really walk well. And she shuffles me into our dining room and there sat 4 members of my home group, led by my sponsor, Tom. They had come and brought a meeting to my home because they heard I couldn't get out and go to one. That's the kind of power. That's the kind of love. That's the kind of commitment that I was given in Alcoholics Anonymous. And in the big book, there's a line in the Gospel of Luke that says, to those who much is given, much is expected. And so I can tell you what, it sure as heck isn't much to do to show up here at 1 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon and get to feel the brightness and the light of Alcoholics Anonymous over 4 hours with you all. The real question is, am I willing to take that call at 3 a.m? I better be. Am I willing to go carry that meeting to that guy or gal's house who can't get out and go to one? I better be, right? Because that's what was done for me. And they didn't just come one time. They came back and they got me and they took me to meetings day after day, week after week, month after month. I couldn't drive. And I was about 2 months sober before I went to my first outside meeting. And it was a place called the Alano Club. It was in Columbia, Maryland. And they helped me, everybody had to kind of help me in and shuffle. They'd shuffle me in, I'm sitting there with my paralyzed face, my eyes open like this, and I talk like this, right? And they set me down in a chair, right? And I kind of hold on because I might fall out of it. I'm not really all that physically capable. And people were smoking a lot then. They weren't vaping, they were smoking like cigarettes. But you couldn't smoke in the meetings anymore. When I first started coming around AA in the 80s, you could smoke in the meetings, but they kind of stopped that. And so what happened in that meeting is right at the end of the meeting, they asked if anyone had 24 hours, wanted a 1-day chip. And I had so many of them from my 3 years in and out. It was like a poker stack of those 1-day chips. I used to throw them in I had a little wooden box on my dresser and I'd throw those in there. And over 3 years, I had a stack about that big of 1-day chips. I'm great at quitting drinking. I had a little stack of about 3 1-month chips. When it's really bad, I can quit for a month. And then I had 1 3-month chip. And so that just goes to show you how powerless I am. If, I'm really good for a day. If it's really bad and you put me on antabuse, I might be able to make a month. If you put me in a treatment center, put me on antabuse, and surround me with people who are like shoving A down my throat 24/7, I might make 3. But I'm a powerless drunk man, and I can't make it much more than that without something big happening in my life, right? And so what wound up happening is I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, I can't get another one. I can't get another one of those aluminum 24-hour chips, not in front of everyone. And so after the meeting was over, they all left me because they all had to go smoke, and they forgot about me, and they just left me in this room by myself. And there was a 1-pound coffee can full of those aluminum 1-day chips, and I began to think that I probably ought to get one of those, and no one was around to see it. And it was probably a good thing. So I struggled to get up to my feet, and I worked my way around to the front of that table, and I reached down and I pulled out one of those aluminum 24-hour chips, and I looked at it, and the thought came to me, and I believe it was sent from God. This is the last one of these you'll ever get, one way or another. This is it. It's your last chance. It's your last chance, right? And I never want to forget that. Of all the chips that I have, that's the one I value the most. I've got that 3rd edition big book that I got in the rehab in 1989 that I scratched the sobriety date out. It's got the new one in 1990, and it is so highlighted and torn apart and falling apart that I put this leather cover on it. And a leather cover on the front has a place for a chip, and that 24-hour chip sits in the front of that leather cover because I carried that chip in my pocket for 2 years because I never wanted to forget. I rubbed the 24 hours off by putting my fingers in the pocket and rubbing that aluminum chip until there was no more writing on it. And of all the chips that I have, that's the one that I value and cherish the most. And so then what happened? What happened for me is a miracle that happens for many of us, like clockwork. I became willing. Desperation made me willing. I had that part in the clouds of alcoholism where there's willingness and desperation. And thank God I was surrounded by good teachers. I had a great sponsor, Tom, and Tom believed in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. He believed in the 12-step program of recovery. He believed if a drunk like me had any shot at not dying of this thing, going insane or being locked up in prison for the rest of their life, that it was in the 12 steps. And he got me right into that. Step 1 was not hard for me. Admitting that I'm powerless over alcohol, that my life's unmanageable. I spent 3 years in and out of AA, absolutely getting convinced that of and by myself, I cannot keep from taking a drink. On page 30, it talks about conceding to our innermost selves that we're alcoholic. It talks about us being like men and women who have lost their legs, they never grow new ones, right? That's the kind of language it uses in our big book. And it spends an exhaustive amount of time in the doctor's opinion and Bill's story and there is a solution, right? And more about alcoholism, right? It spends an exhaustive amount of time until we get to We Agnostics, getting us to the first step. And I identified myself through there. I had been living that hell for 3 years. And unmanageability doesn't get any more unmanageable than I was and still be breathing. I literally I'm 22 years old. I was young and strong and proud at one point, and I am literally paralyzed and can't walk hardly. When I eat, food falls out of my mouth. When I go to bed at night, I literally have to tape my left eye shut so I don't go blind. And I have been doing that for months at that point. Come to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity, came to believe. You know, really the bridge between 1 and 3 for me is you. It's you, right? Those 4 men sitting at my dining room table, and the thought that maybe, just maybe, they're right and I'm wrong. It hasn't worked for me in 3 years, but I haven't done what they've told me the program is. I did 1, 2, 3, drink, 1, 2, 3, drink, 1, 2, 3, drink. I knew about alcoholism. I read books on alcoholism. I read the big book a lot of times, but I hadn't taken the 12 steps of action. Maybe they're right. I doubt it. But what else do I have to do? I'll follow their direction. And a crazy thing happened to me. And actually, Bill and I almost had the same reading, because it's a powerful reading for me. And so what happened for me is, with about 2.5 months sober, as I'm reading the book, as I'm working the steps, as I'm beginning to come alive on the inside, right? I'm absolutely convinced of what we see on page 60 to 63. It was most of what was read today. And I just want to hit that a little bit, because I never want to forget that it doesn't have to take long for big changes to happen, for that spirit to be awakened. I'm literally 2.5 months sober. Nothing has changed on the outside. Nothing. A matter of fact, I go to the neurologist every couple of weeks, and they're saying, you're going to be the way you are now the rest of your life, Dave. I think the brain has recovered all it's going to recover. Get used to it, because this is the way you're going to be. You'll have to be on disability. And I'm losing my mind, because the disconnect between what I look like on the outside and what's happening on the inside makes me think that I'm absolutely crazy, because what's happening is hope's happening. My spirit is coming alive. I'm beginning to have a spiritual awakening. And on the inside, I'm finding peace and joy in the midst of looking like my life is over on the outside. And so I call my sponsor as we get to page 60, and we look at the ABCs, and we look at whether or not I really believe that I'm an alcoholic, that we are alcoholic and couldn't manage our own lives. Dave, do you believe that? Yes, Tom, I believe that. Dave, do you believe that probably no human power can relieve your alcoholism? Yes, Tom, I've tried for 3 years. I believe that probably no human power can do that. Dave, do you believe that God could and would if he were? Tom, you know how bad I am. I think I'm too bad for God. And Tom laughed at me. He laughed at me. Kind of a little bit like what Bill said earlier about his son, right? Tom laughed at me, and he said, Dave, he said, the problem is you got a small God. And I'm like, what do you mean, Tom? He said, you got a pile of crap that's about 6 foot tall, don't you? And I said, yeah, it's as big as I am, Tom. My life is I've done nothing but wreck things for the last, I don't know how many years, but certainly the last 3 or 4 that I've been in and out of AA. I've done a lot of damage. And he said, but you've got about a foot tall God that you believe is judgmental, that you believe isn't powerful enough to forgive a 6 foot pile of crap, don't you? And I said, maybe, I guess, Tom. I said, well, where am I going to get a bigger God? And I love AA. Tom says, he says, you can borrow mine. I'm certain he's big enough for both of us. And so I borrowed Tom's God. And so I said a prayer to Tom's God in the 3rd step. And I said, Tom's God, you're broken in with drunks, man. I'm going to give it all to you, right? I know I can't run this thing, right? And I became convinced that, God is the principal. I'm his agent. He's the father. I'm his child. And Tom told me a great story about rowing a boat. I live on the water and here in the Chesapeake Bay, and I grew up, around the rivers and the bay here. And he said, I bet when you were little, I bet at some point you rowed a boat, didn't you, Dave? I said, yeah, Tom, I rowed a boat. He said, what direction do you row what direction do you face when you row? I said, well, on the boat that I had, Tom, I always face back, always face backward. He said, so you couldn't see where you were going? I said, no, Tom. He said, well, Dave, he said, the 3rd step in giving your will to God's a lot like rowing a boat. He said, God's sitting in the helm, and he's got the rudder, and he's steering the boat. He said, it's your job to row, not to steer. He said, Dave, you just row the boat. And God's got an amazing place that he's going to take you if you let him. He said, now don't get looking over your shoulder and get one oar in the water, because then you'll go in circles or you'll go back the wrong way. He said, Dave, just row the boat. Just row the boat. And I've been rowing the boat for 30 years, not perfectly. There's plenty of times when I get looking over my shoulder and I think I got a better way to go. Me and God go in circles, or I go back a little bit or whatever, but it's never been bad enough that I've had to take a drink again. And what happened for me is when I made that decision, when I made the decision to let God run my life, exactly what it describes on the top of page 63 that we read in Bill's, in front of Bill's talk, happened for me. But I want to talk about it because it's a powerful, powerful, powerful thing. It says, when we took such a position, and that means the third step of letting God run our life, all sorts of remarkable things followed. We had a new employer, being all powerful. He provided what we needed if we kept close to him and performed his work well. Established in such a footing, we became less and less interested in ourselves, our little plans and design. More and more, we became interested in seeing what we could contribute to life. As we felt new power flow in, as we enjoyed peace of mind, as we discovered we could face life successfully, we became conscious of his presence, and we began to lose our fear of today, tomorrow, and hereafter. We were reborn. 2.5 months sober. This ain't 30 years that I get this. 2.5 months. And you know how I know I was reborn? I felt it on the inside. I thought I was losing my mind. I called Tom up and said, Tom, I'm losing my mind. And he listened to me. He was an experienced sponsor. And finally, as I, blurted out and tears ran down, and, I'm an emotional guy now. Spirit fills me up, man. But what I brought to you was a guy that was closed off from all of that. And when it came out like it does now. But I hadn't seen it or felt it, since I was a little kid, and it seems so crazy that I would be like just filled with this joy and this love and this peace and this power when everything seems so broken on the outside. And I told Tom about this, and I'm crying and I'm, blubbering, and finally I said, Tom, am I losing it? Am I losing it? And he says, no, Dave, you're getting it. And what I had was a spiritual experience. And that gave me the faith to continue on. And we said I said the third step prayer, and we made it kind of a date to do my fifth step. There was a spiritual retreat that was happening in September of that year. My sobriety date is June 23rd. So, I'm coming up on about 3 months, more or less. And he said, Dave, we're going to go to the spiritual retreat. And it's on the mouth of the Severn River overlooking the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. It's not too far from where I live now. And I get a chance to drive by there sometimes and look at that view. And I get to picture Tom and I on the shores of that river and down below that retreat, and doing that fifth step. And I began to write in 4. And as I was writing in 4, I went to the neurologist one day. I go every 2 weeks anyway. And he throws 2 MRIs up on the screen, and he goes back and forth, and I can see that he's perplexed, and I don't quite understand what's happening. And finally, the guy turns to me, and he's got this baffled look on his face. And this is a guy who's got, he's got 20-degree things looking on, he's got all these different, frame things that look really important on the wall, right? And he looks at me and he says, son, I can't explain it. He said, but your brain has been rebuilt in 2 weeks, and you're not going to be paralyzed anymore. The next day I wasn't paralyzed. The next day it seemed like everything came back like that. And it's kind of above my spiritual pay grade. I know not everybody gets miracles like that. But I knew where it came from. Because that guy even said to me, after he said that, he said, I don't know what you're doing, son, but whatever you're doing, keep doing it. And when he said that, I wanted to scream out to him, it's AA. It's AA. It's Tom's God, And I wasn't paralyzed the next day. And, a month later, I stood on the shores of the Severn River with that guy who's old enough to be my grandfather. And I told him exactly who and what I was. And I wasn't a nice guy, man. I carried guns. I drank every day. I sold drugs to people. I lived the street life. And most importantly, the things that I had done to the family that loved me, and at the end, when I had poured everything out to him, and he was a little Irish guy. He's like 5'10". I'm 6'2", and I'm now I'm back up and standing straight. I'm 6'2" and probably 220 at the time, right? By the time I get to the retreat, I've been back in the gym, and it doesn't take long when you're young to kind of start getting back in shape. And I can't even look at him in the eye, and the tears are falling on my shoes because I'm faced with the man that I am. And I'm faced with the wreckage and the hurt and the pain that I've caused in my life. And I'll never forget that man takes his thumb and he put it under my chin and he forced it up to where I'm looking at his eyes. And he reaches up and he grabs me around my shoulders and he pulls me in. And I just sort of start sobbing on his shoulder, so broken. And he whispers in my ear, he said, Dave, he said, God loves you a great deal, son, and so do I. He said, welcome to Alcoholics Anonymous. You may never have to drink again. And what I found in that moment is something that is priceless and that most human beings on this earth are never going to find, but we get day in and day out. Is that when we share exactly who and what we are, even the worst of it, and we get loved, not judged, it does something that words can't describe. And I didn't have a Bill Wilson mountaintop experience, but what I knew is my AA roots grasped new soil after I did that. I knew that was something I had never done before. And because I had done it, that something was changed in me that was going to last if I stayed close to it and kept moving forward. And 6 and 7 at that retreat I did that night, I took the hour, I looked back, made sure I didn't hold anything back. And, and I said the 7-step prayer. I didn't want to be the guy I was anymore. And I can tell you what the 12 and 12 says, the 6 and 7 are the steps that separate the men from the boys and the women from the girls. It's the spiritual path. And I wasn't made pure as the driven snow, but what I was begun to taught was, and what I have been taught and know today is that I'm not the man that I want to be, but I'm not the man I used to be. And that process in 6 and 7 allows me to continue to go to God with my brokenness. And there are still plenty of areas that are still broken in me, and ask him to make me better. And he does, little by slowly. But that's the power of being here over days, over weeks, over months, over years, over decades, is we get to be not only reborn, but rebuilt. And so what happened is I went on with 8 and 9, and I began to make amends. And amends for me kind of look like they're kind of twofold. They're the amends that I make right in the beginning, the people that love me the most, the grandparents that I live with. I mean, they're watching all this. They're watching the miracles happen. They're watching AA show up at the house. And when I go to them and tell them that there's no words that I can say to describe the pain and the harm and what I owe you. And they said, oh, honey, don't you worry about the money. Don't you worry about anything. You just stay close to Tom and MAA people. That's all we want from you. You just stay close to AA. And that's, again, to reach out to people like my mom. My mom's sober by now, but there have been many of those, 4 a.m. phone calls to Florida where it's all your fault. How do you make amends for that, right? There was people that I owed money from, employers that I had stolen from, and I was on a couple probations already, and here I am going to show up and admit to federal level crimes of stealing things from, all kinds of places. But I did anyway, because it's what you all told me I had to do. And what I found is that people were a lot more forgiving than I thought they'd be, and I had a chance to make the money right. And then really what amends is about for me, it's about inviting the people that you damaged the most into your sober life, and one day at a time, bringing them into this sober way of life and letting them experience the joys and the pains, but letting them experience every amazing mountaintop, and asking them to help you to walk through the valleys, right? And that's exactly what I did with the people that I love the most. Some of them aren't here anymore, not in body, but I got quite a bit of time to try to set right those wrongs, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that. 10, 11, and 12 is really the power of where I live. Our book talks about, growing in usefulness and effectiveness, right? It's really all about me being greater use to God and to you, not what I want, right? I keep forgetting that sometimes. That somehow I think, if I really do the right 11th step, I'll hit the lottery, right? I'm already kidding about that. I kind of know better than that spiritually now, but there is a certain sense of like, okay, I'm on borrowed time. Who did I borrow it from? What is it that I think they want me to do? And I'm pretty sure that what my God wants me to do more than anything, there's never been a question in my mind about since the day that I came to you and June 23rd, 1990 is, my God wants me with you. And he wants me to tell others about what he and AA has done in and through my life. And that the age of miracles isn't over, it's just beginning. And we get to see it. We get to see it like clockwork. My first year was amazing. It was mountaintop. I went back to college after I got unparalyzed. I got through a bunch of legal stuff, and I was on all kind of probations, and that all got sorted out. And I stand up at my first year anniversary with 14 members of my family sitting in the front row with tears of pride and love, and just all the best of all the emotion that you can have. And there's not a dry in the place, man. And I wish that if there's anybody on here who's new, and man, if there's an experience I'd wish for you, it's getting to see the eyes of hope and love and tears in the people that you love's eyes for your new life in AA, and knowing that it doesn't have to stop, but it can keep on growing, right? And like a lot of us, I after I got my first year, I thought, well, now it's time for me to get my stuff together. I got some ground to make up for, and what a lot of folks will realize is that it's kind of a dangerous part for some of us between like 1 and 5, because all of a sudden I got this sobriety thing down now, Mr. AA, don't you know? I've done the 12 steps. I've gotten very serious about the big book. I'll lecture you on it if you're doing it wrong. I don't care if you've got 30 years. I'm going to tell you exactly how to do step 4. You better have that 4th column in there, or you're a loser, right? That's me, right? At a year sober. Can still be me sometimes a day if I'm not careful. And I get real serious, and then I'm also starting to chase things. I started doing really well in school, right? Like, wow, I can make the dean's list. My God, if I don't quit and I show up and I take the principles of AA into other areas of my life, it turns out, but I'm painfully single, so I'm looking for her, of course. I got to find her, because that's really important to find, and I've got to do things in order to kind of make myself look good, like spending money I don't have, to buy things I don't need, to impress people I don't like. So what's that look like for me? It looks like getting student loans to buy race boats. I really needed a race boat. I needed a motorcycle. I needed a Corvette. I need all these things. I need to spend a lot of time in the gym so I look really good. And then I find myself, I'm a couple years sober, and I'm Mr. A. I'm going to lots of meetings. People are starting to ask me to speak. I like speaking. I get to tell everybody how wonderful I am. And then one night I'm, at a bachelor party with a buddy of mine in high school, and all of a sudden it hits me that Mr. AA is going to drink. And I couldn't believe it. I thought I had power again, and I didn't. And thank God that, because my feet had been moving in AA, even though I was in the middle of a situation I couldn't get out of, and knew I was going to drink surrounded by people who were drinking, and it looked good, it looked fun. And I was in some emotional pain from some things that had happened in my life. The girlfriend that had broken up, the guys in AA, she had actually broken up with me to go out with a friend of mine in AA. That'll give you some resentments, right? And was a member of my home group. So I had to see them there together, right? Every week. Good times. I'm getting the gifts of sobriety now, right? And I said a prayer, and the bus pulls over, and a guy gets on the bus. And I'm like, why are we pulling over? Why is that guy getting on the bus? I just said a prayer. The guy gets on the bus. It was a guy that I was sponsoring 6 months before who's drinking, and I'm not drinking yet. And God sent me a little bright light, hey, want to do some 12-step work, buddy? Here you go. Your 12-step work tonight is showing this guy that AA works, and you ain't drinking. And I knew it. And I'm like, thank you, God. And I turned back in and I doubled down. And don't get me wrong, that 2 to 5, ego is something that let me be clear. I was broken, destroyed. That first year was amazing and beautiful because my ego was kept in check. And the ego, it's like sobriety is a bit of a run and gun battle with my ego, to be honest. And I don't think I'm all that different than most drunks. A guy named Harry Tebow, who is kind of Bill Wilson's psychiatrist, talks a lot about that in some papers he wrote about us, about how the ego rebuilds and how it's insidious in the ways that it works. And any success that I have in life, it just reinforces. Any success I have in sobriety just reinforces it. So it's a constant, trying to be rid of self, trying to help others, right? And I'm doing that. I begin to sponsor people, I'm running around AA, right? And then about 5 years sober, I meet her. There she is, April, my wife. I know right away. I'm like, ooh, she's new. I haven't seen her before, you know, and she's beautiful. And that's what caught my eye first. And, you know, but I had learned, so I stalked her a little bit. You know how you kind of, you know, don't want to just jump right in and ask somebody out. And it turned out that her smile was genuine, and turned out that her heart was big, and it turned out she had a solid program, and she had moved here from California and had about a year sober, and I'm sober about 4 at the time. And she got a friend of mine to be her sponsor. And so I followed her around a little bit, started showing up where her home group was, and she started popping in where my home group was. And, you know, after a couple of months of that, I asked her sponsor if I could ask her out. And her sponsor said I could. He knew my intentions were good. And I asked her out, and our first date was at a funeral for an old timer in AA. And then we went to an AA meeting. We walked around Baltimore's Inner Harbor, near where I almost got killed at. It was a really, you know, surreal kind of AA kind of, you know, first date. And but at the end of it all, end of that night, I came home, and my mom used to tell this corny story about when she met my dad. That, you know, she came home, she didn't like him, didn't want to go out with him, but she went out with him just to, you know, get him off her back. And she came home from the first date, and my grandmother said, "So how was your first date?" Expecting to hear how horrible it was. And she said, "I'm going to marry that man." And I thought that was a corny, you know, kind of love at first sight kind of story. But, you know, I always appreciated it. I knew my mom, and meant something to my mom. And I came home that night after my first date with my wife, and nobody was up because I was out a little late. But I looked in the mirror and I said, "God, if you'll have it, that's the woman I want to marry." And a year and a half later, we were married. And so, you know, between five and 15, you know, I talked about year one, right? You know, mountaintop, hope spot, a bucket full, age of miracles isn't over, right? Perfect day transformation. 2 to 5 is trying to not let my ego kill me literally every day. And the only thing that saved me in that was keeping my feet firmly planted in AA. I kept doing the work. And so even though my head and my ego was trying to drive me out, you all kept pulling me back in, and I kept trying to take the action. You know, I meet my wife, we get married, you know, I build a house right next to where my grandparents lived, the ones I had lived with. They give us a piece of property. I build a house for us. By now I finished a bachelor's degree. I finished a master's degree. I'm working on a PhD, for heaven's sake. And so now I'm building houses, I'm married, the wife's pregnant, I'm trying to finish a PhD, and it is like trying to do it all and do AA and be Mr. A. And my wife's really active in AA too. So we're trying to balance this all and I'm failing, and I'm pretty sure the PhD isn't going to work out. And you know, I'm busy getting married and building houses and stuff, and I don't do the work I'm supposed to do for my PhD, and my advisor fires me. And then I have to go back and make amends to him because I took a bunch of money to do some work that I didn't do. And I said, "Hey, it's really cool if you want to fire me, but let me do the work that I promised I'd do." And I did, you know, for free over the next semester. And actually it worked out pretty well. And he said, "All right, I'll give you a chance. You keep doing what you're doing, you know." And then we had our little girl, Summer. Had our little girl. And I tell you what, man, being a parent is the most, you know, is the most amazing experience that I've ever had. It's not something I wouldn't trade for the world. And if you don't have kids, it's just, for me, I grew up, one of my dreams that I had as a really, really young kid was maybe one day I'll get a chance to be the kind of dad I wish I would have had, because my dad got killed in Vietnam. And my mom was so broken, she couldn't remarry until I was almost grown up. And here I am holding this little girl. You know, holding this little girl, man, you know, right on my chest, watching cartoons, falling asleep on my shoulder. You know, her first smile is at me, first words to me. She's daddy's little girl, man. She's 22 years old. She's still daddy's little girl. And I don't have a lot of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a story through my daughter. I'm going to tell you about my life, what it's been like to be a dad. First of all, it's been hard, because for a guy like me, being a dad forces the awareness of just how selfish and self-centered I am. And a couple years later, we had my son, and I don't want to skip him either, because I could tell you a whole bunch of stories. So I'll kind of tell it maybe around both of my kids. He's 19 now. And I'll tell you what it looks like. I'll tell you what life in sobriety looks like. It looks like you know, the kids are little and they're not sleeping, and my wife and I are trying to do AA and build careers, and it's just freaking crazy, and we're barely holding it all together day to day. And if you're in that phase of life, man, God bless you. It is hard. It is hard. It was hard for me. I've got a bunch of guys I sponsor who are in the middle of it now. It was hard for me. It's hard for them. I think it's just a tough phase to try to do it all, right? But one day at a time with AA, we got through it, and we began to teach those kids what it's like to live spiritual principles. We built a home where spiritual principles were practiced. You know, our kids were these little kids running around AA conventions and having Uncle Dave and Uncle Mark, right? You know, and Aunt Sheila over, right? And, you know, we're putting the kids to bed and then have sponsees coming over to do step work, right? You know, I get a chance to finish that PhD, and I damn near failed it 3 or 4 times, and God came through in the end. And again, I don't think God gives a crap about another PhD engineer on the face of the earth. I think he just wants me to tell you that there's enough power in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous and in God that he can take a guy laying in a bed with his brain scrambled who can't even read a book anymore and make him a PhD engineer if he wants to, just because he wants to show off a little bit, right? And I tell you what, as that girl grew up, I know what it's like to have 4 fingers wrapped around one at the daddy-daughter dance. To stare with my little girl, you know, in her little corsage, you know, at the little school dance, feeling like, man, luckiest guy in the world, you know. And I know what it's like to, you know, a couple years later to pack them all up on a plane and go live in England for 3 years and travel the world together as a family, to have a snowball battle in the Colosseum at Rome when it happened to snow out of nowhere for 25 years, you know, and we're having a snowball battle to learn how to ski on the Swiss Alps on glaciers that are blue enough, like blue as the sky, right? I'm a kid who never got a day trip to the beach hardly, you know, and here I am, my kids get to see the world. We get to see it together, to be close enough to a lion on the Serengeti that you could pet it, you know. Those are the things. And all the time, you know, when I got to England and it was for a work thing, I worked for the government, and we were in the middle of the war, of Iraq and Afghanistan war, and we were fighting, you know, the Brits were fighting alongside of us, and I do intelligence work, and we were all hanging out there together trying to keep our soldiers safe. You know, see, I get a chance to further the legacy of men like my father who gave their lives for this country and what I do every day, and it matters. And I know what I do matters there. And you all have given me a heart for service, whether it's here with you or whether it's to our country or to others, or to men like my father, right? I've had a chance to look them in the eye and shake their hands and know that maybe I kept them alive one more day through some of the things that I've had a chance to do, right? You all have given me that privilege and that honor, and I still get to do it today. You know, we traveled the world and we came back home, and a couple of years ago, I'll kind of wrap it up a little bit around sort of some recent things. And, you know, and my son and I, you know, we like to snow ski, and he and I have had trips where, you know, we're out on a 13,000-foot mountain on a big bowl, and, you know, he's like 9, right? And here we are dropping into this bowl together, right? Skiing down this, you know, this amazing white snow in Breckenridge, Colorado. And, you know, and we've just had these amazing experiences we've got to have together. And there's not enough time to tell you about them all. But a couple of years ago, we got a chance to go down the Grand Canyon. We got a chance to do whitewater rafting, do 280 miles down the Grand Canyon as a family. And everybody loved it. My son broke his arm halfway along the way, and he still loved it, even with a broken arm. We got him through there, and he loved it. It was an amazing trip. It was kind of a spiritual experience for all of us. And it was so much so for my daughter that she decided that's what she wanted to do. She wanted to do whitewater raft guiding down the Grand Canyon. And that's where she is right now. You know, and you know, my son's had a chance to, you know, he's a tech kid, and he loved building things and working with his hands. And I'm an engineer and he's an engineer, and so he's studying aerospace engineering now, and we get to share that together. And he's building stuff, and I help him build stuff. Now he's better than I am at building stuff. I can't keep up with him. We get to share those things together. And my wife and I we just have an amazing life. She's 28 years sober and an active member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and you know, and we do this thing. We've done it all along, and it's the bedrock of our marriage, to be honest with you. And there's been ups and downs in that marriage. You know, you stay married for someone for 25 years, and not every day is walking the bar, right? But we've been committed to each other, just like we're committed to AA. You know, a woman named Virginia, when we first started dating, she drew a triangle, you know, pyramid, you know, triangle, just like our triangle, a triangle. She put Dave and April down in each corner, and she put God at the top. She said, if you grow towards God, you'll already grow closer together. And I end with this. My daughter's out in the Grand Canyon, and last week they had a raft flip over. 35 people, 2 rafts. A woman died and 2 people were hurt seriously. And it took the Park Service over 24 hours to get help to them, because you're down in there ain't no getting help to you. Winds were bad, weather was bad, nobody could get to them. You see, you all taught me and my wife through your example how to give our kids hearts, how to teach them to serve, how to put their own needs aside and serve others. And that girl, for 2 days straight, kept 30 people fed and healthy and alive until help could get to them. And I had a chance to talk to her yesterday. And she's okay, because what she's got is a spirit of giving. And what she was so blessed about was that she got to make a difference when people were hurt and suffering, that she got to bring her light and her joy and her service and be the hands and the feet of her God to serve others in their darkest hour and in their deepest need. So of all the things that I have to thank you for, and there are many, many, many things, when I look at the heart of my children and see the principles that you all showed me through your example and through your love reflected in who they are, that is perhaps one of the greatest gifts that I believe you have offered me. So with that, it has been a pleasure and a privilege to be with you here this afternoon at this unconventional convention, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Dave.